All right, well, welcome everybody. My name is Becca Reese. I am the community conservationist with the North St. Louis Soil and Water Conservation District. And we are co-hosting with the Minnesota Discovery Center a program called We Are Water Minnesota, which is physically an exhibit that's hosted at the Minnesota Discovery Center, but then it's also a lot of related events surrounding water, including the speaker series, which for this one, we have Gary of course I practice it. I get it a little off, Kaunonen, who's a historian, author, documentary filmmaker, to talk about water, labor, and the fur trade. And this program is all brought to us by the Minnesota Humanities Center with support from the Minnesota Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment. Many departments within the state of Minnesota, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, Department of Health, as well as the Minnesota Historical Society. And we also have very many local partners too. We've been working with across the Iron Range area to do different events. So a couple things before I move ahead. It looks like we're gonna have a small group, which I can understand on a nice evening like tonight. This is being recorded so that it can be seen later by yourself or by anyone who hasn't watched it in the past. Our past one we had a couple weeks ago with Marnie from the 1854 Treaty Authority that I see on here, is on YouTube, on the Minnesota Discovery Center's YouTube page. So, so this one's also being recorded. During this presentation, we do ask that you keep your microphones muted so that there's not a lot of background noise when we're talking. We'll have time for questions. You can put questions into the chat. Gary, do you prefer questions all at the end, or do you like being interrupted? How do you like to go about it?
Let's maybe just to keep things going, because I'll try and move through things in a timely manner. So let's maybe just to keep things flowing to the end.
Perfect. Okay. So yeah, and if you have a question, you can put it in the chat and then we'll save it for the end and make sure if it hasn't been covered yet, we can make sure that it's covered. Yes, and so if you get a chance to just kind of an overview, my thing can advance just a moment. There we go. So We Are Water Minnesota. It's all about exploring the relationship Minnesotans have with the water and learn what both science and the humanities can teach us about this resource. The traveling exhibit examines water issues statewide and in local communities through personal stories, histories, and scientific information. It's designed to strengthen Minnesotans' relationship with water, expose visitors to new perspectives, and increase participation in water stewardship activities. And it's at the Minnesota Discovery Center through July 11th. It's free with admission. There's free Thursday evenings at the museum, and also they have the opening for the Redhead Mountain Bike Trail on June 26th. So they'll also have free admission that day. And they also like to recognize that the museum and really all across the Iron Range is the land is historically of the Dakota and Ojibwe people. So also related to We Are Water Minnesota, some events upcoming. We have on July 1st, another speaker series on Nibby walks and their cultural significance from Sharon Day, who is a Boys for It band member and also the executive director of the Indigenous Peoples Task Force. She came up with her youth acting crew and performed a play last week at the Discovery Center called We Do It for the Water. And I think that will be, it was recorded and I think it will be posted as a YouTube video also. On July 8th then, we'll have, who's also on the Zoom I saw, Natalia Walker, who works at the North St. Louis Soil and Water Conservation District, talking about aquatic invasive species in our local communities. And then also right now we have, for the entire length of the exhibit, is a virtual BioBlitz. So if you've ever heard of or used the app iNaturalist or the website, you can go out and take pictures of living things, plants, mammals, invertebrates, and upload them to share them with scientists and other people who love nature, and also just get an idea for what's living out there. So we have a number of places selected that you can go out to, like in Hibbing, Cary Lake Park, or Maple Hill Park, all the way over to Hoyt Lake, where on the St. Louis River is Norway Point. So there's a lot of different places you can go. And we're also expecting to have an adventure series. We had yesterday, we went out to the Saxon Bog with a fun group. In July, we don't have the sign up ready yet, but a paddle on the St. Louis River. So there's a website, wearewaterironrange.com, for more information about what's going on in the events and links to the past recorded webinars and other events. And you can always email me for more information. And a lot of this is coordinated by the Minnesota Discovery Center too. Elise, the curator there, she wasn't able to be here tonight, but she is very excited about this presentation. So I know she'll be watching it. So yes, again, July 11th, check out the website for more information. And one thing I don't want to forget is at the end of our presentation, we will do a drawing for some prizes, some fun stuff like a water bottle from the North St. Louis Soil and Water Conservation District. The Minnesota Discovery Center is going to send out a book of Gary's called Flames of Discontent, which is, sorry, I know it's about labor strike history of 1916, 1918, I believe. And then also some gift certificates. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Gary.
Okay, thank you. And let me pull screen up for the presentation. Okay. So thank you for having me tonight. Thank you for those of you attending. I appreciate you being here. I'm down in Wilmer, Minnesota right now, and we have a substantial lack of water, I think, as maybe the rest of the state does as well. And so kind of a timely presentation just about how important water is in our lives. This particular presentation, however, we're going to be looking at water as a landscape in a labor setting. And we're going to look at the fur industry. And I wanted to highlight the fact that I'm using the term industry purposefully versus trade. I first became interested in this topic as a labor historian because I was at Grand Portage National Monument a number of years ago. And I think it was in one of the Palisades, they had a quote from somebody's diary that mentioned the term bourgeois or bourgeoisie. And I thought, well, going back to my marks, this was quite a, the fur trade era was quite a bit before the Industrial Revolution, but we're using terms that show up in Marxist literature and things like that. How does that apply to labor relations? And so I kind of became interested in that and understanding why it is referred to as the fur trade versus the fur industry. And I'm going to try and make kind of a concerted effort here to talk about it as an industry and provide samples or ideas why I refer to it as an industry versus a trade. Trade having some kind of reciprocal or reciprocity involved in it. And so that's kind of what it is. Now, the backdrop for all of this, interestingly, of course, is water, because without water, we don't have any of this going on. And so that's how water comes into the equation here. And we're going to kind of highlight just in the early sections in the geography of the presentation about why water was such a vital component to the fur industry, especially Minnesota's fur industry. Let's go to the next slide here. And so we'll just be going through this presentation outline here. We'll do introductions, the geography, the argument for it being the fur industry, and then the hierarchy of that industry, and then kind of do a day in the life of a working class fur participant. And so I really want to highlight what many of us probably know as the voyageur, because it was really kind of one of the first working class specific jobs that came to national attention. And I'm not purporting to be an expert on the fur trade era. My kind of expertise is mining and labor history from the late 19th and early 20th century. So I'm dropping about 200, 250 years back. But again, this relationship between the hierarchy of the fur industry was very, very interesting to me, because it predates what most people think of as the Industrial Revolution. And so that's really what I'm kind of going to be looking at here, and how water was essential to that relationship. So why we're here, water, looking at that as an industrial setting, and especially as a transportation network. It was the landscape on which this industry or trade took place. Without Minnesota's geography, the benefits of Minnesota's geography and water being in the Lake Superior Basin, this doesn't happen in this part of the world. And it also is the fur industry is one of the first real transnational or global economies as well, because of fashion in Europe at the time. And so our friend in the middle here, the beaver, boy, he was a casualty. So he was a commodity, an industrial byproduct, and eventually a hat. And so again, water and those landscapes in which, and the environment in which the beaver lived and the voyageur paddled were essential. And then finally, we're taking a look at the voyageur as an industrial cog, a working class toiler, and kind of a cultural iconoclast. We have some pretty romantic notions about the voyageur, but he was one part of that fur industry. Probably uniquely the most celebrated part of that. We don't hear about the bourgeois or the owner class necessarily in the fur industry, but we really have come to know more about the voyageur just because of it was very romantic. It was difficult. It was tough. We don't have, of course, statistics for deaths, but I can't imagine it was safe in any way. But we know a lot about the voyageur, and that's kind of unique in that worker-owner industrial relationship. Oftentimes when you think of cars, you think of a person like Henry Ford. You don't think about the men and women who were making those cars, excuse me. But in the voyageur era, just simply by the name, we know about the working class person that was kind of the backbone of the industry. So just to get everybody kind of on the same page, let's look here at the geography a little bit. And many of you have probably heard about this. And I know growing up in Minnesota, it was part of Minnesota History 101. But it really was an international endeavor. Going all the way from Europe, where Hudson's Bay Company, which was one of the big three fur companies, was located, to what is now Canada, to the US, and even to parts of Asia, where Hudson's Bay Company was doing trading with some Asian markets. in China, especially. And especially John Jacob Astor, who founded the American Fur Company. He was doing some not so great things over in China as well. So really a transnational marketplace here that the fur industry was serving. And of course, I'll use my cursor here, just because of its location next to the hinterland and the vast wilderness that could be tapped for the natural product, being the beaver, the fur. Minnesota was in a great spot, as well as what, of course, is now Ontario. So some of the big names that jump out at us are Grand Portage, Fort William, which is just on the other side of the border. And then getting into northeast Minnesota, places like Lake Vermilion, Rainy Lake, Lake of the Woods, and even Lake Mille Lacs, and down into the Minnesota Historical Society has a site called the Snake River Fur Post. And that was a Northwest Company trading post that has been maintained, recreated, but there's interpreters and things there. And so this is kind of the regional look at what was going on. The fur trade was, especially from the Northwest Company, ran out of Montreal. And then you can see the connections here. All of this, of course, being water. And so the voyageurs, of course, traveling in canoes, across the big lake in the huge canoes that would take 10 people carrying 4 tons of cargo. And then the canoes getting smaller, the number of people getting smaller as we work our way into the interior. A look at some of that interior here is a kind of a closer in look up at Grand Portage and Fort William and some of the waterway links, which would have been, we think of them now as great recreational spaces. These were industrial workspaces, as hard as that may be to believe, for the voyageurs, the Native Americans who were doing the trapping and trading at the posts. And so this was thousands upon thousands of mile workspace that would be engaged by working class folks in that very, very early industrial era, kind of a proto or pre-industrial era. Same way for, we're looking here at Sayers Post. This is down in what's now kind of the Pine City area along the Snake River. That's where the Snake River Post, the Northwest Company Post, was, Sayers right there. And so getting to there from Lake Superior. And then that, of course, would hook up through Savannah Portage with the Rum River and the Mississippi River, and folks could move down through there. That was a pretty long portage. Not, I don't believe, as long as the Grand Portage, but a long one. But the closest area where you can kind of cross over between that Lake Superior watershed and then the Mississippi River, kind of up around here in Lake Sandy area. So kind of giving that geographical background and where we are looking at, I want to look at the fur trade versus the fur industry, and why I'm going to argue that it was an industry and not a trade. I've got some bullet points here, and just as I'm going through these, the reason that trade gives me pause is because we have kind of this romanticized, especially in this area or in this era, of what trade is. And we really usually think of it as kind of a reciprocal, or there's some reciprocity involved in that. One person giving somebody something, the other person receiving that, and then giving that back. That was not the fur industry. And sometimes when we go up to, let's say, a place like Voyageurs National Park, or even that post on Snake River down in Pine City, it's hard to imagine the international scale and how much money was being made. The folks at the bottom of the hierarchy, especially Native American folks, but also the voyageurs, the French Canadian, the Métis people, were not receiving the same type of recompense for their labor and for their contributions to the fur industry. It wasn't even close, because some of the owners of the Hudson's Bay Company, Northwest Company, and later the American Fur Company, we're going to highlight John Jacob Astor, were multimillionaires. And so it was not an equitable trade. And so that's why I paused to think of it as a trading economy. It didn't act like that. It was an industry. And so how do we define industry and how do we think of industry? I've got kind of a quick definition there. Economic activity concerned with the processing of raw materials. In this case, the raw material would be pelts, fur, and the manufacture of goods in factories. Well, if we want to think of this industry in more mechanical terms, and it can be thought of that way, we can think of the humans in this case, the Native American Métis people who were out trapping in the cold winter, the voyageurs who were treated in their canoes like machinery, literally strokes. Everybody had to be paddling together in unison like a machine. We can think of them as the machinery, and we think of the water, those pathways, connecting networks, the waterways, as lubricants, or the oil to get that machinery, or to keep that machinery running. And then of course the good was the fur. And so the metaphor that humans were cogs in this industrial machinery, it isn't that big of a leap. There's even a factory in this case, York factory up in Manitoba. Although they didn't do a lot of processing or making of the hats that became the ultimate product of the fur industry. It certainly was looked upon as kind of a factory, because that's where the system administrators and the traders would come together and ply their trades. And of course, like any other industry, there was exploitation of workers, but also the environment. And there was environmental degradation. And we can maybe think of it, well, paddling canoes, there may be some waste, but the environmental degradation, if we think about it hard enough, think of it from the beavers' point of view. I'm sure they weren't real excited about the fur trade. And so removing them almost to the point of extinction during this fur industry era really altered the landscape. I think beavers, probably second only to humans, have incredible impact on the environment. And so taking that, almost that entire species out, certainly had a big impact on the environment. So all of these things that are associated with the industrial era, or the Industrial Revolution, we can see the nascent beginning of that here in the fur industry. Talking a little bit about the three big multi-million-dollar fur corporations, we got the Hudson's Bay Company, as you can see there, incorporated in 1670. Largest and most profitable headquarters was in London. The upstart was the Northwest Company, which these two companies, which were often at war with each other. Once Britain consolidated, or England consolidated its power, the British government forced Hudson's Bay Company and Northwest Company to merge. There were wars in Rupert's Land, which was kind of the up into the Athabasca, and in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Saskatchewan area. There were wars over forts and land and trading grounds. So it was kind of an all-out skirmish to try and gain ground and gain territory. And these were multi-million-dollar corporations. Hierarchy and ownership. They sold shares in the company. And today, even Hudson's Bay Company is still in existence as a goods bartering and selling company. And so after the U.S. gains its independence, the American Fur Company, which was owned by John Jacob Astor, comes into existence. And so after that, the Revolutionary War, and then we get into the early 1800s, and by the War of 1812, the American Fur Company established its dominance in what was going to be becoming parts of Minnesota, but then to the west as well. And so let's take a look a little bit here at the hierarchy of this industry, starting off with the owner, John Jacob Astor. He was the first multimillionaire businessman in the U.S. He was American of German birth. He was a real estate investor, but also interestingly, he was an opium smuggler. So he was willing to make a buck pretty much any way he could. Ended up establishing a monopoly in the fur industry, but then left in 1830 because he saw that fashion in Europe was moving away from beaver pelt and these beaver hats. And so he got out of it by 1830, but the American Fur Company remained. And so he really began his career in the fur industry in 1794 with the Northwest Company. But after 1807, the U.S. placed an embargo, and through Thomas Jefferson in 1808, Astor began the American Fur Company. Probably we have the closest, or I shouldn't say we, but most of us may know of the American Fur Company through, if you ever visited the Mackinac Straits area, Mackinac Island became the headquarters for the American Fur Company, and then later moved west, and there were subsidiaries like the Pacific Northwest Fur Post Company, the Southwest Fur Company, and so it diversified. But by the 1870s, the resource was depleted and things kind of degraded after that. And so this term bourgeois, which really was the term that got me interested in this overall, and I want to look specifically at the Northwest Company and how they had their hierarchy set up in regards to the traders or the middle class folks in here. And it's interesting to note that by 1799, the Northwest Company had over 2,500 employees in a very hierarchical style. The bourgeois or the master class or the middle class had even layers to it as well. So we had the Montreal merchants who were owners of the trading companies, the underlying subsidiary companies, and they were shareholders. They could invest in as many shares as they wanted. They were mostly centered in Montreal and would have lived quite nice, affluent lives. They did this hiring of staff. They organized and provisioned trips into the inland parts. They exported the furs from Montreal back to Europe and really handled kind of the raw goods or the raw materials being the fur and got them back to Europe where they were made into hats. Then we have the wintering partners who were derived their income strictly from the shares that they owned from the company. And they could have up to 1 or 2 shares and they received their income from these shares. They wintered in the interior and managed districts. So you may have a district manager in Fond du Lac or Duluth and Lac-La-Puy, which would have been Fort Francis, which is just across the Canadian border from International Falls. And so they would have been charged in a district. So all the little posts that were scattered out throughout the district would have been reporting back to these wintering partners who would have been in charge of those small little posts. And then you had clerks, the folks who were the salaried employees. So um, they didn't have the shares. They would have been salaried employees um, who apprenticed for 5 to 7 years. And then the idea was to move up into that partnership. And so you can begin to see this kind of pyramid structure that's creating the hierarchy around the fur industry. Uh, and through all of this, kind of an interesting part is that there was a fixed status to this. You were, in many respects, born into this lifestyle. For the Northwest Company, um, you were most likely Scottish, you're most likely Protestant, probably Presbyterian, and the only way in was to be in some type of a kinship tie, or by marriage, or by proving yourself and working your way up from a clerk. But then you still didn't necessarily have that status as somebody who was born into it. McTavish would be a name that's commonly associated with the Northwest Company. Very Scottish name, and somebody who was a merchant, the part of this merchant class. And so the next one, and the one that I kind of want to highlight here, and this is a good image to highlight that, because we have both some voyageurs, but also Native American people sitting around doing the actual trading that made the industry go. And so even here in this, what I'm going to call the working classes, there was a lot of hierarchy, from everything down from skilled, semi-skilled to unskilled workers who were sometimes even so divided by hierarchy that the place you sat at in your canoe, or in the canoe, in the voyager's canoe, determined your status on the job site. And so we'll kind of go over those. Often these folks were called the engages, or the engages. And that term was also kind of used more loosely to describe the voyageurs, so the lowest level of this hierarchy that we've been talking about. And even here, we had different levels. We had the pork eaters, who would go from Montreal into the interior, into Grand Portage. They were called the pork eaters because that's what they were able to eat. They eat salted pork. And it was seasonal work for the most part in the summer months. These were the large canoes that would go across the Great Lakes and all the way into Grand Portage. And 10 plus men carrying 4 tons of cargo, trading supplies to Grand Portage, furs, and that back to Montreal. And then in the interior, we had the winterers. They traveled the interior. They went from Grand Portage into the hinterland, picking up goods to trade, traveled inland. In the winter times, they may staff a post. And of course, they had the smaller canoes. They did a lot of the portage work, or the portaging, bringing the canoes overland from, like, say, a river to another river, to a lake, small lake, whatever it may be. And so these were the men that were carrying the big sack bundles, 90-pound sack bundles, often 2 at a time, with the head strap and then the pack hanging off their back in the portages. And these folks were mostly French Canadian, some Métis, but Catholic. And again, we can see some of that distinction there in the hierarchy. The merchants and the bourgeois class being Protestant, and some of the working class being Catholic. So even along religious lines, we can see some of these distinctions being drawn. And as I was discussing a little bit earlier, even your position in the canoe determines status and pay. And so people like the bowsman and the steersman would get 5 times the pay of, so the people sitting on the opposite ends, or the bookends of the canoe, were receiving 5 times the pay, were oftentimes skilled workers who had been on these expeditions and had the experience, they were being paid 5 times what the people sitting in the middle of the canoe or the middlemen or the milieux were being paid. Sometimes they were unskilled or semi-skilled labor who hadn't been on a lot of these voyages, and they were really receiving a lot less money, because even the interpreters and guides were receiving up to 3 times as much money as the middlemen. So just within the canoe, you can see that hierarchy involved in the industry. And then, of course, we had the folks that really made things go on the ground, the trappers, oftentimes Métis and Native American folks who were capturing the raw product, and then would do a lot of the work to get the product ready to be traded. And that's the scene that we see here. Folks, perhaps an interpreter sitting there. He may be of Métis background with a voyageur talking with some Native American folks trading. You can see the trade goods there and some of the furs that are laying around. And so very intricate dance that was going on. The voyageurs oftentimes, in addition to being very hardy, strong-willed, had to be good traders and business people as well. And so I thought just taking a look at kind of a day in the life of working class fur and looking at some of the culture here would be interesting. And so I found this image, and I thought it was especially useful because it shows these smaller hinterland canoes. If we want to contrast this canoe we have here, you may think, well, you probably heard that voyageurs would time their routes across waterways and inland seas by pipe smoking. So how many pipes you'd smoke to get to one place. And it was sun up till sundown. So a day in the life was get up at the crack of dawn. Sometimes even the person that was determined to be the cook would get up earlier than that or have things ready from the night before. And then you would get up and have breakfast, paddle for hours and hours and hours, however many pipes, singing songs. And then you would stop for a while, have some lunch, paddle again for hours and hours and hours, a portage or two, maybe, determined by rods, at how many rods, hoping for small portages because you were carrying that entire load of the canoe with you. And then when night came, some supper. But if we're looking at, excuse me, let me go back to that. The cooking of the supper here, but you think, well, how did they sleep? This gives you a good idea of what those conditions out in the woods were like. Right up next to a waterway, and then underneath your canoe, you prop the canoe up, lay under it, perhaps do a canvas or something like that over the canoe. You can see another one here, and that was the sleeping space. And for a lot of these areas, we certainly know, and it hasn't gotten any better, that one of the biggest and most difficult things in Minnesota summer is dealing with the bugs. Not only mosquitoes, but those nasty biting flies, horse flies, whatever it may be. All of these things were part of a day in the life. And so, again, I think I mentioned earlier, we don't have statistics, but the casualties and fatalities of being in the fur industry were especially difficult for these working class members. Sleeping out under the stars, dealing with whatever was being thrown at you in nature, whether it was storms, bugs, wildlife, whatever it may be, tipping of the canoe, dealing with some of threats from local people who are having their lands being tread upon by people that were foreign to that area. Just all of the different things that voyageurs encountered And then, of course, what the people were trapping, what they encountered as well, doing the trapping in the wintertime primarily, sub below zero weather. It was a really, really difficult life when we contrast what people like this gentleman here was doing, sleeping under a canoe, versus the life of a guy like John Jacob Astor, who was living in New York City in a townhouse, multimillionaire person. So we have all the hallmarks of industry, of a very developed industry prior to the Industrial Revolution, where um, people like the gentleman sleeping under the canoe here, or this gentleman trying to get a pipe lit, their life experience versus the life experience of somebody like John Jacob Astor, even the McTavishes, who were merchants who were living very well in the middle class, upper middle class lifestyle. So all the hallmarks of what Marx described in the Industrial Revolution were present uh, in the fur industry as well. And so the working class culture, fur culture, very, very rich. And I think that's probably why most of us know more about the voyageur than we do about a guy like John Jacob Astor. It was the stuff of legend, and it was highly romanticized. The voyageur dressed in colorful clothes, led very colorful lifestyles. You can see here playing cards, the dress, a Four Winds coat from a wool blanket. Drank a lot at rendezvous like the one at Grand Portage. Um, just amazing party. I'm going to say it, and amazing parties. A lot of um, adult beverages probably being consumed. It was a really kind of romanticized lifestyle now. When you're on the ground and you're in it, very, very, very difficult. But out of that working class culture came um, some unique experiences, and those get relayed to us, especially because a lot of these folks in the voyageur class, the Métis folk and Native American folks, wouldn't have been able, or probably didn't have the opportunity to write some of this stuff down, either through illiteracy, or that perhaps they just didn't feel that their experience was worth recording. Um, that happens when I do interviews. I interviewed a lot of people that have worked in mines, and the first question is, why do you want to know about what I did in a mine? They don't see their life experience as being something that is remarkable, but it is. And so we don't have that surviving historical record oftentimes from voyageurs from their own perspective written down, but we do get a lot of it that comes through song. And so what I want to do right now is play the French language version of the song. It's called Pull the Oars, and then I'll play the English translation as well.
Qui nous mène, c'est l'aviron qui nous mène en haut. C'est l'aviron qui nous mène, c'est l'aviron qui nous mène en haut. J'ai point choisi, mais j'ai pris la plus belle. J'ai point choisi, mais j'ai pris la plus belle. J'ai pris mon nez derrière moi sur ma selle. C'est l'aviron qui nous mène, c'est l'aviron qui nous mène en haut. C'est l'aviron qui nous mène, c'est l'aviron qui nous mène en haut.
Okay, again, and so a song like this would have been the song, maybe after some adult beverages, but also they were known for singing while they were pulling the oars, and that's the literal title of this song is Pull the Oars. And so something to do while you're sitting in that canoe going across Lake Superior, or paddling down the St. Louis River, or wherever it may have been. And the lifestyle and the experience is recorded in these songs. And so for those of us who don't speak French, let's listen to the English version of Pull the Oars.
As we roll along together, roll on the oars as we glide along. Lifted her up so she could ride beside me. Lifted her up so she could ride beside me. Not a word we spoke as we rode along together. Pull on the oars as we roll along together. Pull on the oars as we glide along. After a while, she said, I'd like a drink, sir. After a while, she said, I'd like a drink, sir. But she'd not drink the water from the fountain. Pull on the oars as we roll along together. Pull on the oars as we glide along.
Okay, so that kind of gives you a good idea of what voyageurs are probably thinking about after months in a canoe. And I think this would kind of be some typical thematic material for men who had been out in the interior for months and months at a time when they get back to Grand Portage, or if they were the pork eaters who were making their way back from Grand Portage to Montreal. So really a unique time capsule there, saved in song, that gives you an idea of lifestyle and what was being thought about by people who are involved in this occupation. And so really doing the conclusion here, we want to think about this idea of how water acted as an industrial lubricant for the fur industry and the important part that it played. And I was just thinking about this today while I was doing up the last parts of this presentation. So what happens if water is such an essential part of this industry? What happens when I was looking at some of the data as far as how how low rivers had gotten? So what happens when the rivers are low? You have to, your job doesn't stop. You got to pick the canoe up. You have to do more portaging. It's more difficult. So even the environmental conditions, how much rain you get, how much rain you don't get, had such a huge impact on this industry. And it was an industry. It was part of a global economy before transnational economies were even on the public radar. And I think good evidence of that is that we contrast the robber barons, the people like John Jacob Astor, with the people who are on the ground doing the really difficult work. And what's unique is that the voyageurs, I think, in the historical memory, have gotten a lot of credit for their work, but romanticizing it and calling it the fur trade, I think doesn't help our understanding of the actual industry, because there was a lot of hierarchy and there was a lot of difference, and it wasn't as equitable as a trading economy. So with that, stop the share here. And if there are, I think, did we get, oh yeah, we have some questions.
Yeah, I saw specific, there was one question, you mentioned, I think it was a Scottish family name.
Yep.
Was it
And
McTavish?
Yep, McTavish, and that's the spelling that I am familiar with up there. So big M, small c, big T, Avish.
Thank you. And someone mentioned the Museum of Fur Trade in Nebraska. Has anybody been there? Have you been there, Gary?
I have not, no. I haven't gotten out of Minnesota as far as my understanding and knowledge of the fur trade.
That would have been me, Becca, Meg, and I.
Oh, sure.
I expected it to be a half-hour visit, and we spent an entire day there. It's amazing with the materials that they have there.
Okay.
Interesting. Yeah.
Let's see. There was another one here that was. Think you should acknowledge the unpaid role women, played in the fur trade. The integrated riding pemmican. Yeah, this was a really. There was even pemmican war that occurred, and Métis women especially. I think we're involved in all of the issues that some of the working class folks were involved with, but even had more difficulties because, you know, we do, it's just like miners. We hear a lot about mine workers in the mining industry, most of them being men, but we don't hear as much about women who operated boarding houses or led strike parades. And I have a feeling that the female role in the fur industry was much the same, that a lot of the difficult work, although it is acknowledged to men in the industry, such as the voyageurs, I think women were probably doing a lion's share of that work, especially with the pemmican, because as a food, it was so essential to the fur trade that, as I said, there was an actual war called the Pemmican War that was fought in Canada just because it was such an essential staple of the diet. That was a great, thank you, Margaret, for bringing that up.
And I was talking with Gary a little bit before everyone joined about how I used to work at Sudan Underground Mine State Park, and I can really kind of see those connections to the industry and how you were talking about like the divisions of labor, you know, where they were and how much they got paid versus, you know, their position within the industry. So that's really interesting because I just didn't know, I don't know a lot about the fur trade. And I'm not, well, I've worked in some museum type settings. My background is more the natural history side of things. So yeah. Any other questions? Because then we'll also do the prize wheel. But I want to make sure everyone who has questions gets to ask them. Ron?
I just wondered if Gary had anything to say about my tongue's kind of in my cheek when I mentioned water, giving water this use, but I don't know about the American Fur Company, but the Northwest and Hudson's Bay used water to cut the high wines that they carried, the extremely strong liquor, which was not mainly for the use of the voyageurs, maybe for an occasional celebration, St. Andrew's Day or something, but was as reflected in the journals of the Northwest Company, very much a very deliberate, callous use of water of the high wines, these extremely strong liquor, and cutting it by certain amounts with water for particular Indian groups. A little more difficult to trade. Well, maybe they need the stronger stuff. No difficulty. Don't want them to get drunk. Cut it with water. There's quite a bit about that in the journals. I just wondered if you'd heard anything about that.
No, I had not. You know, I don't think there was a lot of, just from knowing what I know about John Jacob Astor, I don't think there was a lot of, I don't think business ethics was a course that was being taught at that time. Because Astor himself, as I think I mentioned, in 1812, after the War of 1812, there was kind of a crash in the fur industry as people were trying to, figure out what to do. Well, in 1816, John Jacob Astor, with funds from the American Fur Company, bought a whole lot of opium and smuggled it into China where it was illegal. And so to think that the American Fur Company would have a morality play about whether or not to cut or how they were going to ply Native American métis or voyageurs with alcohol doesn't seem like it would be a big concern.
I don't think the American, I don't think the American Fur Company did that very much in their later years, but they were the later years of the fur trade, but or fur industry. But the one that was best known for that was the Northwest Company.
Okay.
For one of the principal reasons they carried these kegs, and the kegs were bound with metal straps, because if they were gunpowder, they had to be wood straps. High wines didn't explode, so good secure kegs carrying this very, very lethal stuff. I don't know what percentage it was, but it was way up there, so it was easy to cut it.
Okay.
And sometimes it was a mixture of things.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll have to take a look at that.
No.
Oh, look at this.
Okay. Yes, and I learned this from Marnie the 1854 Treaty Authority also has some very interesting and great webinars on their YouTube channel. And that's where I first discovered the Wheel of Names. So I'm gonna do 3. One is gonna be for Gary's book, Flames of Discontent. One's gonna be for a gift certificate to the Minnesota Discovery Center. And then another one's gonna be our Soil and Water Conservation District water bottle, which is a vacuum sealed steel, one of those cool ones. Okay, so I'm gonna spin it, and yeah. Ron, is that Ron?
It's Ron, yeah.
Ron, I think I put Rob in there on accident.
Well, back in the fur trade, I was known as Rob.
Okay, well, I got it. I've got you down.
200 years.
So
thank you.
I will send you Gary's book.
Oh, wonderful.
Actually, the Minnesota Discovery Center will, but we will get it to you. Okay, so next we'll go for the gift certificate. All right, and we have Mike. He might have jumped off right before. Mike, are you still here? Oops, I can't get out without messing up my screen. So he was here till the end though, so I'm gonna keep him on for now. Okay. All right, and Marnie, you get a water bottle. Okay.
Now we're talking.
Yeah. I don't think you're on before when I showed it. Maybe you were, but it's pretty nice. Okay. Yes, and I think Marnie, did you have another question about any other memorable things from Grand Portage Monument? That was a question to Gary.
Oh, okay. Memorable things from Grand Portage. I just think it's, you know, the museum is amazing. This was probably about 4 or 5 years ago I was there. But the things that stick out most in a person, at least for me anyway, is sense memories. So it was, I think, of course, we were driving up from Duluth, and in Duluth it was 80. We got up to Grand Portage National Monument, it was 50. I remember the wood smoke. I remember somebody was baking bread, I believe, at that time. So the smell of bread. It was kind of towards the end of fall, so there were a number of kind of small vegetable plots that were coming to kind of coming to their zenith. You know, it's all of those things that, you know, you step back, and the role that the interpreters had there really gives, and that location, what, you know, could have been the isolation. Those are the things that tend to stick with me from visits to historical sites. Even the Snake River Fur Post, I went there when I was a very, very young kid, and the interpreter, the person was in costume, the costume interpreter, again, the smell of the smoke, the isolation, the traps that were hanging up in the post, all of those things seem to have, I mean, I love the interpretive text. I'm a writer, and I do write interpretive text, but those sensory experiences are the ones that seem to stick with people more.
And then also, Ron, were you talking about St. Euros Day earlier?
No, St. Andrew's Day. I was just explaining that. Assuming the bourgeois might be Scottish, the crew, or the brigade, whatever, the pork eaters would be always hankering for a holiday, something to celebrate, to have an excuse to broach the keg, like a baptism at North South Lake, the place where a pork eater became a winterer. And the bourgeois would not be looking forward to this, because he would know that the next day would be a wash. Everybody'd be sick. So, you know, I just meant St. Andrew's Day. It might be an example of somebody might bring up, hey, it's St. Andrew's Day, and the bourgeois might feel connected to that and have to feel that he had to allow the men to party. That's all. No, not St. Urho's Day. This is long before that. This is a really good presentation, Gary. I look forward to reading your books. I'm a big fan of unions, union literature.
Oh, yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Someone asked, Gary, are you with an organization? I know you've done some work for the Discovery Center, but
Yep. Yeah, I work with the Discovery Center part-time as exhibit researcher, and yeah, and I've worked, did a documentary on the 1916 and 1917 strikes. That was the 16 strike, of course, was in the mining districts, and the 17 strike moved up into the lumber camps, logging camps. And that, you know, that was as far as size goes, that was a massive strike in 1917, just geographically. that affected all the way from the Virginia Rain Lake Sawmill in Virginia, Minnesota, all the way up to International Falls and over to Bemidji. There's a documentary. It's called Northern Minnesota's Labor Wars. So that's on YouTube when I did some contract work for Coochiching County Community Television, KCC TV.
Yeah, I think I did see that on YouTube, and
Oh, okay.
I will watch it someday. So,
Well, thank you.
yeah. Yeah, this was very interesting. So I will add kind of a resource to our website for some of your information, Gary.
Okay, good.
But otherwise, does anyone else have any questions? We thank you very much for coming out tonight. If you're interested more in We Are Water events, you can check them out at We Are Water and WeAreWaterIronRange.com, where I shared it before. And I'm pretty sure you'll get an email inviting you to the next speaker series, which will be on July 1st with Sharon Day from the Indigenous Peoples Task Force, talking about Nibby walks. And then on July 8th, it will be with Natalia Walker talking about aquatic invasive species in our local communities and what we can do. So yeah, if there's no other last questions.
I had one comment.
Yes.
Thank you, Becca. This is a great presentation. I'm with the Lake County Southern Water District.
Oh, okay.
The board, and I'm going to make sure that the troops down there know about this.
Great. Yeah,
what you guys
wonderful.
are doing up in St. Louis.
Sure. Yeah, and we work with a number of the staff with Lake, SWC, Tara, Emily, Derek, all of them. They're great. So thank you.
And the other day I was talking with somebody who knew their Minnesota history, and we're talking about the incredible price of lumber at the moment. We almost have to take out a bank loan to get a half dozen pieces of plywood. And this guy who was a Finn, he said, yeah, I think the camps in northern Minnesota are on strike again.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Yep, I just see a lot of thanks in the chat. Any last words? I will.
Jimmy Gwetch, Gary, and also Ron for bringing those things out too. Gwetch.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Good job, Becca.
Thanks.
Thanks again.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you,
Good night.
Becca.
Good night, Gary.
Good night.
There we go.